Hi there. Welcome to another training session on Decisions version 8. In this session, we will learn about case management and configuration folders in Decisions. We will particularly look at some of the key areas when it comes to case management in Decisions. We will see how to create case entity data structure. We will see how to define entity states. We will create a data folder to store the information about the cases. We will create user action flows and the trigger flows, and we will execute a process in case entity. Before we get started, a quick definition of case entity data structure is that it's a folder-based data type that has multiple states that can be defined. And the states are not limited to following a linear process from start to end. The states and the process can move from one to the other in any direction. And that's when case entities play a very important role. The use cases where we might have back and forth between the entity states. This is how an entity configuration folder looks like. And this is the place where we would be creating our different entity states. And we can define them like how it's being defined here as started, in progress, and completed. And you can also notice that we can add state using the add state button. And we can add activities for each states. Now, these activities can be user defined, which can be triggered by a user by some action, or we can also have trigger flows, and they do not need the user action to be performed. They get triggered when the process moves in that particular state. So we would look at some of the deep dive features of case entities in today's training session. So what I'll do now is I'll switch into Decision Studio, and this is where they would learn and create case management use case. So I have created a folder for me where we would be building our exercise, create case entity training folder. And what we would do is we would go inside the designer entities, and we'll start by defining our case entity data structure. To do that, I click on create data types, and we would select for the case entity. And we will give it a name. Let's call it support ticket, because the use case which we would try to implement is where a user can come in. There's a request for something that the support team can help them with, and that support ticket will go through different stages of its process from the start till end. And we would implement that using our case entity data structure. So we will have name, so that the request raiser can provide who they are and their employee ID. We will have the query category, so we know what category of query that they need resolution for. And then we will have the query itself. And we will also have name by date. And we will define that type as date. And we will have comments, so that whoever has worked on that request can send back some of the comments or the notes, what has happened to that. Or it can be an answer to the question they have asked the support group. And then we will also have assign to as one of the attributes, so that we can keep a track to whom this process was assigned. Now, there are a lot of other activities that will be tracked by the case entity in the extension data, and that's something which we will look at just in a minute. So with that, we are good, and we can go ahead and click save. Now, when we do that, you will notice that in the background, we have two rows connected in this particular designer folder, two different entities. Once it gets compiled, we'll go ahead and look at them. So let me click back into the root folder of designer entities. And you can notice that this is the case data structure which we just created, support ticket. And if I want to make any change, add any values or any attributes, I can define them here and go ahead and save that. You would also notice that we get this entity configuration folder. We can access that by clicking here, or I can also click on this and go inside the configuration folder. This is what we saw in the presentation, the place where we define the different states. And we can have activities, which can be a user action or a trigger flow. We can add states. So we'll start by defining the states for the process which we are building. So the first state, we will call it as ticket created. We'll have second state, which would be ticket in process. Then we'll add one more state and we'll call it ticket on hold. So this state where we say ticket on hold would be the state when the support group doesn't have enough information to work on that ticket. So what they can do is they can just mark that as ticket on hold. And what this case entity structure would do is this configuration folder and how we are setting up these states, as in when it hits ticket on hold, it's going to go back and get reassigned to the user who created that ticket. So we were going in a sequence from left to right, and from this ticket on hold, we can go back to the previous state. And that's the power of case entities. So we'll create rest of the states in our process. We will say ticket resolved if the ticket has been resolved. And we'll have one more state and we'll call it ticket completed, so that if we ever want to go back and see what was there in that ticket, we can have a look on that. So we'll just do a quick check if all the spellings are correct, because these states would actually be represented by their state name when we would be moving between the process. So what we're going to do now is we'll start creating the workflow for each of these different states that we see on the screen and define our use case. So what we would do now is we will take an option and see what are the different ways I can create a user flow. I can have a user action flow, or I can also have a trigger flow. But before we do that, we would need some forms so that the users can work on them. So we would go ahead and create those forms. So the first form which we would create would be so that the user can request for some support ticket. So we'll call it raise support ticket form. We're going to go ahead and click create, and decisions take us to our form designer in version 8, and we can start building our form. We can call it submit as the user action. We can use any of these controls to kind of build our form here. We can also provide the title. In this case, it'll be raise support ticket form. We can also pick CSS just by click of a button, and it gets applied to our form. On the top, we can use save, preview, view options to see how our form would look like when it is built. So we'll start having the controls which I need. So we'll have the name of the requester. They would have their employee ID. Then we'll have the category. So we will use something called drop-down list. And we will call it query category. And we were going to define that as string. And we would use static values. It can be query related to the HR department or the finance department, or it can be IT, or it can just be others. Then we will have the date so that we know when this needs to be completed by, and we will call it need by date. And we'll have one more control that we will call as the actual query. And we can expand our forms, edit them, resize them, and even add more rows as we want. So I just added 2 rows so that I can extend this and make it slightly larger in area so that we can get the queries here easily. And I'm going to go ahead and save this form. And one more thing I want to do is I want to define the input for this form, which we can call that support ticket. And we're going to pick the type as support ticket. And I go ahead and save that. So the reason I do it is so that I can map these inputs so I don't have to do that in the workflow. So for the name, I will pick the name. For the employee ID, I'm going to pick the employee ID. For the query editor, we will pick the query category. For the need by date, we will again pick the need by date. And finally, we would pick the actual query. So with that, my form is ready and I can go ahead and save that. So this is the first form in the process, which would be shown to the end user who needs to request. So we would need one more form to be assigned to the support team. And we are going to call it review support ticket form. So we would have a lot of same values so that they can have a look of what needs to be done, but we would be adding some more. So I would add a couple of rows to make some space for my controls. And I'm going to drag and drop another line box, and I'm going to call it comments. And I can again expand this and map it to the comments that I have as part of the attribute of this data structure. And then along with submit, we'll have one more path, because in case the support team feels that there's something missing in this query and they need more information, they can send this ticket back to the requester, and we will call it put on hold. So with that, our second form is ready. We will have 2 paths coming out of this, and we can go ahead and save it. And we will have one more form where we would be reassigning the same ticket back to the requester so that they can provide some more information. So we're going to copy this and use this form. We will just change the name. We'll call it resubmit support ticket form. Excuse me. When I hit create again, we get inside the form designer, and we would just change the button names. We will call it as resubmit. And we would not need this path because we would just be submitting back. We can go ahead and save this. And one final form which we will create would be to view a support ticket after it has been closed. So let's go ahead and create one more form, and we will call it view support ticket form, and go ahead and hit create. So with that, we have all our forms defined. And we would not need any of these paths. We would just keep it as submit and call it close. And we would just get rid of this put on hold path because we don't need that. This form would just be used to kind of view the support ticket in the future. I can go ahead and save it. Now we have all the forms that we need. Now what we would do is we will start by creating our first flow that'll act as the starter or the very first flow for the whole process that we are solving. So let's go ahead and create a flow, and we will call it raise support ticket main flow. So when the user comes in to this application, this is the first flow that will be triggered as per the action that they take. Let's go ahead and hit create. So we are in our flow designer. As you can see, this white space is where we would be creating our process using these steps which are available to us on this left-hand side toolbox. On top, we get some user actions to save our work, to test our work in debugger, and also add checkpoints. So the first thing that we would need is a form. So I'm going to drag and drop this step called show form. And we will pick or create because we already have created it. So I'm going to use something called pick. And we will choose the form which we just created, which is this raise support ticket form. And as I do that, you see we have a submit path coming out of this. And when the user fills the information and clicks on submit, we would want to create an entity so that we can save the information in the database table. So I come to user defined types, expand case entity, and I am going to find my database structure under support ticket. And out of all these different options that are available to me, I'm going to use something called create support ticket and connect it to my flow. Now, there are a couple of things on the right that we have to configure. So first one is the extension data. So extension data gets created when we are working with the case entities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click pick and map it to the support ticket, which is coming out of my form. Then we have folder description. We can use any of these options, merge HTML text, merge plain text. I'm going to use something very simple, and we will say new ticket created. And we are going to give the folder name. So we can use a merge plain text option this time and click on show editor. And we would pick in support ticket. And inside that, we will go ahead and locate case ID so that every time a new ticket is created, it has a unique ID. And we will say created and hit save. And the one last thing we want to do is to map this to the parent folder ID. So this would be the folder that'll store the data that has been created by our process. So we go into and locate that inside custom, inside the VA training folder. You would see I have defined this data folder and I map that here. And the next thing I would want to do is set a state. When somebody has raised a ticket, we would assign that a state. So I'm going to search for a step called set state. And we would use set entity state. I'll connect that with my flow, and you would see that there are two things that I have to map as part of the inputs. In the entity ID, I'm going to click on pick, and I'm going to map it to the folder ID. And for the new state, here we will mention what is the state that we would want this process to move once the ticket has been create it. So I'm going to say ticket in process. And we have to keep the name similar or exact same to the name of the state that we have. The last thing I would do is connect it to my step. We can click on ignore so that our flow is neat and clean. And I'll go ahead and save this. So this defines our first flow in the process, which would be used to raise a support ticket. We are raising it through a form, we are saving that entity, and then we are moving that to the ticket in process state. Let's go ahead and save. And now we'll go back into our configuration folder and start creating the rest of the flows of the process. So what happens now is when somebody has created that request, it would move into ticketing process. So we are going to define an activity here, and we are going to define a trigger flow, because this flow will get triggered automatically when the application reaches ticketing process state. So let's click on trigger process, trigger flow, and call it review support ticket. Review support ticket flow. And we go ahead and hit create. Now, trigger flows also look very much similar to the user action flows. We get the same flow designer, and we can start creating our workflow. So the first thing we would need is when the ticket gets assigned to the support team and they come and work on it, they have to see a form so that they can see what they requested. So drag and drop this step called show form, and I click on pick or create. We will pick one of the forms which we have created, and it will be review support ticket form. And you would notice that there are two paths coming out of this. For the put on hold path, we would connect that to a state. We will call it set state. Or let's just search it here real quick. And we will use set entity state and connect that put on hold to the state. So what I'm doing here is when the support team says that there's something missing in this, they can click on put on hold button in the form and it'll take this path. And what it'll do is it'll automatically assign our process to a particular state. And in this state, what we would want to do is we will send it to ticket on hold state. And we'll connect it to the done path. And we would map the entity ID to the folder ID which we have. Extension data, and then the entity ID. So with that, it would know where does it have to go and kind of update in the process, and moves to the put on hold state. And the submit path, if everything is good, we would selectively update the query with the answer. So again, I go back into our case entity, the support ticket, and use something called selective update. And what I do here is next. We would configure this particular step that we have here. And before I do that, we'll also have to map in the information on the form. So we will pick support ticket and we will map it to extension data so that this form automatically picks all the information that's associated with that particular case. Then we come back to this step to update the things. And one of the things that will be updated would be the comments. So I click on select from flow, go into the extension data. The support ticket, inside a support ticket, I would map that with the comments. And the comments are here. And then the next thing that we would do is we would also update some of the other fields here. And one of those fields would be the extension ID right here. And we will map this extension ID to the extension data. And inside that, we'll have extension ID so that it exactly knows which particular case are we talking about. And we would also map this form instead of in session to assigned so that when this process gets triggered, it gets assigned to someone. Let's say it gets assigned to me. I can provide the name. I can keep it very simple and say review ticket. And I can also give the assignment action name as review ticket as well. So again, we move back onto our selective update step and see if everything has been mapped correctly. So here again, we will just mention my email ID and see the comments have been mapped and also the extension ID. And the next thing that we would do is we would add another state here, which will send the process to the approved stage, the process. So again, we search for state, set entity state, and connect it to our workflow. And we would use the same steps as we did for setting this particular step. I'm going to pick and then click on extension data. And I'm going to click entity ID. And we will define the new state as ticket resolved. And I would connect the done path to the end step. So with this, our flow is completed. So to sum up, what we did here is we added a form step so that the reviewer can see what the ticket is. Then they can perform two actions, either submit that, which is basically approving it, or they can put it on hold. And each of these steps would take the process to two different states. One could be the ticket is resolved, or another could be that ticket has been moved to ticket on hold state. I can go ahead and save my workflow. And you'll notice that that's how it shows up here, right under this particular state in the process. Now, next thing we would do is we would add a trigger flow for the ticket on hold stage. And we will call it send to requester flow. And this is the part of the process or the use case where we are actually going back to the previous stage in the case entity. So what we would do is we would just be changing the state of the process using set state step. And we will pick this, select the extension data, and then map it to entity ID. And the new state here will be the first state, which is created. And we'll go ahead and save it. So what's happening here so far is we are creating a ticket which moves the process to ticket to process. Somebody works on it, and then if they approve it, it goes to ticket resolved state, or it goes to ticket on hold. And if it goes to ticket on hold state, we again send it back to the ticket created state. So what we do now is we add a trigger flow here again, and we will call it re-submit support ticket flow. And we go ahead and click create, and it takes us again into the flow designer. Now, what we would want to do here is we would have a form that will have all the information about the ticket which was raised by the same person in the first place, along with the comments, so that they can take some action and maybe rectify the query or provide more information. So I'm going to start by having this quick form, and we will use this form which we created that's called resubmit support ticket. And we would make that an assign to the same user who had requested it in the first place. And we will say review ticket as the assignment name, and we'll keep the same for the assignment action name as well. And we would map the support ticket with the extension data. But this extension data is holding all the information about the process. So when somebody comes here and triggers this flow, this form would automatically show the information that was submitted in the first place. And that's being held by our extension data. The next thing we would do is we would want to update the information which has been captured by the user. So we go to user-defined types, case entities, and the support ticket, we use selective update step, connect it to my flow, and then we'll come to the right-hand side and configure it. And the next thing that we would do here is add and configure this particular step with the query, because this is what they would be updating. So we will click on select from flow, we'll pick the extension data, and we'll select query. And in the extension ID, we would click select from flow, we'll go to extension data, and then extension ID. And finally, we would send this to the new state. So again, I look for this step called set entity state, and we connect it to our flow. And again, just like the previous entities, we provide the entity ID by clicking on extension data and then selecting entity ID. And in the new state, it will again be ticket in process. And once that is done, we will just connect it to the done path. So what's happening here is this is a flow which we created where the user would be shown this form where they can make changes to the query that they had raised in the first place. And then we are updating that query in the database table and telling it to which case we have to make that update to. And then finally, we are setting the state so that the process moves to ticket in process state automatically. So let me save and come back into our configuration folder. And the next thing we would do is add a trigger flow for ticket resolve. So what we would do is we would add a trigger flow and we will call it send email flow. And what that means is when it has been approved, we are going to trigger an email to the requester, and we drag and drop this step called send email. And it can come from, let's say, admin, and it will be sent to requester. In this case, it's me, so I'm going to keep it constant. And we can provide the subject and say request has been processed. In the body, we can use merge HTML text and use the information, their name. I can expand extension data and grab the name and say your request has been processed. and click save. And we can also send attachments if we want to add some more settings. But we're going to keep it simple and move the process to the final state. So again, I would use this step called set entity state, connect it to my flow, configure the entity ID by going into my extension data and then picking entity ID. And the new state here would be ticket completed. And I can go ahead and connect it to my endpoint and step here and save this flow. So what's happening here is we have added the respective flows in each state, depending on what we are trying to do here. We'll add one last flow in the ticket completed. And again, it'll be a trigger flow. And we will call it ticket completion flow. And this would not have anything inside that. It's just to kind of complete the process. Now, if there's something you want to send more notifications to someone when the process is complete and the request has been answered, so you can send an email or some sort of notification, but we will keep it simple and not have that here. But one more thing I want to do here is add a user action, which we would do just in a bit. Before that, we would actually go ahead and see how this works. And when we execute this, the information will get processed. So we need some place to kind of track that information. So what we would do is we would create a quick report, and we are going to call it case management ticket report. And coming to our report designer, pick the case entity, which is support ticket, and add some of the things which we would want to track. The first thing can be the case ID. And then we can have the name of the person, when do they need it by, the query category, the query, and also let's have the state. And we'll use this attribute called folder ID to send information to the audit trail so that we can capture what's happening to that particular row or that particular case. Now we can hide that because that's not something which we need to show on the report, but we would certainly need that to kind of get the information about that particular case so we can show it on our audit trail. I'm going to go ahead and save it. And we will quickly create a page where we can host this report which we have created. So I'm going to click on create report, page, and select page, and we'll call it case management page. And hit create. So this is going to be a simple page that will have a report here. So we are having this report viewer, and we can pick the report just like this, and we are going to have audit trail, folder activity panel. Now this kind of captures the information about the process step by step. And we would use get folder ID from selection bus, and we're going to give the same ID which we defined in the report, which is FID, and we can go ahead and save it. So when we create pages and decisions, they have to be displayed somewhere, and we use a folder to kind of host that dashboard. So I've created this dashboard folder. I'm going to click on manage page dashboard. Just a second. And I'm going to click on add page dashboard. And then I'm going to give a name. This can be support dashboard. And we're going to pick the page which we just created. and save it. So when we click on that, we are actually going to see the page which we created. Since there's no data yet, so you are not able to see anything here. So let's actually go inside the main flow and run it. So this asks us for the support ticket form. Here, let's give it some name. Let's call it Jamie, employee ID as A123. They need something from, let's say, IP 515, and they need, I need laptop. And they can go ahead and click submit. So what happens is you see that there's something have been assigned, and now we have some data to be displayed on the dashboard. So you can see that this is the report which we created. We have the case ID, we have the name, need by date, category ID, and not just that, on the activity panel, we can actually see what state is at currently. So the process was created, and now it has moved to ticket in process state. So the person who it is assigned to can go into their inbox. In this case, it's going to me, and they can work on this ticket. And they can actually see this is what have been approved or submitted by the requester. They can say that right now they need to know which laptop they want, because information was not complete. So we can't submit that. We need more information from the requester. So we put that on hold. So when I do that, again, a ticket is assigned to the requester. And let's switch back into our dashboard and see what's happening now. So you see, this is the ticket which we are talking about, and it has gone back into the ticket created state, which is the current state. And you can also notice the ticket created state also reflects in this report. So again, we go into our inbox and review. And here you can actually see what we need to provide. And I'm going to say I need a laptop, and this time we will say Dell Inspiron and click on resubmit. And when we go back into our dashboard once again, and see that now it has been assigned into ticket in process state. So whoever it is assigned to, they can go into their inbox and again work on the ticket. And this time they can say approved, or they have purchased that item and they just want to mention that it has been approved, and they can pick it from admin. And this time they can go ahead and submit save, because as you see, the query is updated now. This time it shows Dell Inspiron, and they go ahead and submit. And if we go back again to our dashboard, you would see that ticket was resolved, and now it has moved to the ticket completed state. So this is the beauty of case management in decisions. We can go from one state to another irrespective of the direction. And when we right click on that, we can also add some user actions. Right now, you will not see one. So let's go ahead and create. So to do that, we go back into the designer for the entity configuration folder. We're going to click add activity, and we will click on user action this time. And we will call it view completed flow. And hit create. So you can see again, we are in our flow designer. What we would need here is just a simple form that will be view support ticket form, and then we'll connect it to the end step. And we would assign it to the support ticket that we have. It'll be the extension data, and then we click done and go ahead and save it. So with that, if I go into the dashboard now, and when I right click on this ID, you can actually see we have this view completed ticket. And when I click on that, it actually shows me all the information that was captured. So they can see the name, what was requested, the need date, and the comments. So just like that, we can have as many user actions in case we want to remind somebody of a task, if you want to change a task, change the product that we are looking for or the query that we have. So we can come here and use the user actions on the case entity. So this was about the case entity in decisions, and the most important takeaway would be that case entities are used when we have a process that can go back and forth in any direction and not just linearly from left to right. So here we saw ticket was created, moved to ticket in process, then ticket on hold. Then again, we went back to ticket created, and then again, the series went. So we can take that flip from any step, any stage, depending on the use case. So that was about the case management and decisions. We also have extensive documentation. We can go to documentation.decisions.com, switch to version 8, and look for a case. And when we do that, we can look at how we can create case entities. And this is what we did today. But if you want to take a deep dive, you can go through this documentation. It's very elaborative and very well explained. You can see what are the different things that you can do with case entities. I hope you had a good learning in this session. Thanks again for listening. Goodbye.